If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today, I want to talk about focus and how it truly works in our own lives and what it means for us as knowledge workers. And my goal is to explore why we, particularly as knowledge workers, really urgently need to practice and master the skill. In our current world, distractions are rampant and our attention spans constantly challenged. And thus, the ability to focus has become more valuable than ever before. Now, I will say, while mastering focus is important to productivity, it's not just about more speed. It's about doing our best work. It's about producing quality in a relatively shorter period of time. But we also deepen our experiences with our environment and with other people, which is critical if you're going to have strong relationships. Ultimately, I've found that this leads to a more thoughtful and effective mental life. And since we're knowledge workers, we need a thoughtful and effective mental life, obviously. Now, focus is not something that comes naturally to us, and it's not supported well at all in the modern culture. Instead, it's a skill that needs to be mastered and trained, much like your body and your physical skills need exercise and particular workouts. So why this is going to be valuable to you, we'll do some motivation around focus, and that will help you understand why to do the work necessary to train your focus. We'll talk about some actionable ideas about what kind of work to do. And the interesting part is you don't really have to go to a gym. A lot of this is based on mindset. And then we'll talk about some key benefits of having this much stronger focus that develops over time. When we talk about focus, what I mean is the intensity of our attention on a particular subject or item or task on a part of our environment, whether that environment be another human being, a piece of learning that we're trying to accomplish, or even an entertainment or music, and be able to pull that attention together and organize it. Different words are commonly used here. I would say deep work is probably Cal Newport's favorite way to express that. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow state, and you may not have heard his name, and I probably butchered it, but that flow state is one that we attribute to athletes when they're having a particularly good performance. But there's lots of ways to talk about it. And the simplest is when we say to someone, pay attention, what we mean is really, hey, tighten your focus on this thing, consider it more deeply, let it consume more of your awareness, because we think that would be valuable for the person that we asked to do so. Now, when we say focused, it often brings up some image of mental isolation from environmental cues. And that's true. We're homed in on an idea or a train of thought or another human being or something in our environment. And that has a tendency to minimize, I won't say exclude, but to minimize periphery. And so the field of things that can claim your attention narrows when we do this and do it well. And often we use the metaphor of a spotlight. If attention is a spotlight, focus is a tightening of the light beam, focusing our attention, just like focusing the light beam. It's a tightening of it. It makes it smaller and brighter when it hits its intended target. And the point is emphasis in stage, emphasis on a particular character or a particular part of the scene. Even laser beam, okay, really powerful laser beams are really just a light beam that's been intensified in specific ways. And we all know from childhood that a simple magnifying glass, it doesn't even have to be big, can concentrate sunlight enough to start a fire. And so that's what we're talking about. Okay. Now, I will say that this tight focus is not the only useful state of our attention. Sometimes, in some situations, we really want to have a broader awareness of a larger field of possible stimuli. The idea of bird watching comes to my mind, although I've never done any bird watching. Now, that said, tight focus is immensely useful for completing our knowledge work tasks. And I think the ideal for me is to be able to dip into tight focus intentionally and then maybe come back out of it after some period of time, but to really get in and really engage my mind in this subject matter. So now I promised you actionable information, so let's consider that. So when we look at knowledge work, or really much of human kind of work, we need mental clarity, okay? And certainly to focus, mental clarity makes focusing easier. And one of the best ways to do that is to clear your mind. And in this particular situation, we'll talk about mindfulness later. But when I say clearing your mind, I mean the ongoing habit of not using your brain as a storage space for mundane information, particularly tasks. And when we talk about it here, what we mean is getting information out of our skull and out into the world and into the digital environment. And that helps us deal with that information more effectively, but also benefits us because there's not as many thoughts competing for our attention. And this is where we talk about distraction. Okay. Now, historically, the need for mental clarity when we're doing challenging work has been broadly recognized. And it's only lately that we've considered this notion of multitasking. There's an example where in Ben Franklin's autobiography, he's having a long negotiation and he proposes a pause in the negotiation so that both parties can go and write out their current position because their positions have changed over some negotiation. And so he wants to go out and write his down, get it out of his skull. And in this case, the writing clarifies, crystallizes the thought a little bit. But the whole point is to get this mental clarity in, and it can be done in many different ways. Now, I'll say one purpose of attention compass, in fact, a major purpose of attention compass, is to create space for our thoughts and our information so they don't have to clutter up our brains. We get them out into the digital environment. And there are some particular ways that such a thing is best done. And we talk about all of that in attention compass. So if you want some guidance in setting up your digital environment to allow space for more focused work, I'd be honored to help you with that. If you want to do that, feel free to reach out to me, Larry at dobusywrite.com, or I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. So when we get back to this mental clarity and thinking about maybe ways to support that mental clarity and remove the mental clutter, there's another tactic, and this is good, but not core to focus, but it is good. And I'll tell you why. It's called, I refer to it as parking downhill. So when you have to pause a knowledge task, okay, if you're thinking through something and you have a plot line for your novel kind of laid out in your mind, okay, and you have to interrupt that work, a planned interruption even, then what we want to do is leave ourselves a note about where we got to, maybe what's next. Maybe we've been typing about this plot line and leave ourselves a note about, I was considering thing X to happen next. And this helps us more easily when we get back to the work to get into a focused situation more quickly because we have less to worry about in terms of getting our momentum back going again. We sort of jumpstart the next episode of work on this kind of a project. Now, we face enemies for all this. And when I say enemies, I don't necessarily mean personified enemies. I just mean, environments and cultural things that want to pull us away from not only focused existence, but also the desire and intent to live a focused existence. lately in our culture, this multitasking, flighty, flitting attention thing has become quite popular. And in some parts of the culture even seem to be preferred, right? People brag about, oh, I can do a lot of things at one time. You know, I can attend to a lot of things at once. And the answer is no, we really can't. And so when we look at focus, one thing that we want to think about is do we understand this notion of rapt attention? Okay. Rapt attention, RAPT, is a concept from Winifred Gallagher's book by the same name, Rapt. And she talks about this intense attention and the psychology of moving towards greater focus. So this is a source for some of the things that I'm about to talk about in this crisis of focus. I will note another seeming piece of evidence here. There's a thing called the Flynn effect, and the Flynn effect is the name for the fact that IQ scores have gone up. The trend towards IQ scores has been higher and higher and higher over the years. Now, the way it works is they rebaseline it every once in a while, and they want the mean. I think they want the mean to be 100, but they rebaseline it to make that happen. But all the rebaselining has been to pull scores down. Okay, and more recent data shows that the Flynn effect is being reversed, and the IQ scores over the last 12 or 14 years have actually begun to decline, meaning that they needed to be baselined upwards. When the rebaselining happens, it's to pull scores up. And that's really threatening. I will say that the timing correlates strongly with the widespread prevalence of mobile devices and mobile computing. Now, correlation is not causation, okay? But it does lead to a testable hypothesis here. And this ability to quickly dip in and out of focus may seem to be a good thing, and sometimes it may be. I mean, to be perfectly honest, sometimes that may be what's called for, but we can't live there. And particularly as knowledge workers, flighty thoughts are usually not very valuable to people. And so that's kind of what's going on here. And that's another piece of evidence. There's an additional piece of evidence that's really kind of interesting, and I'll have to interpret this for you. So in Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, she talks about an experiment where, and I may not have it exactly right, but I'll give you the gist. A worldwide test for middle school students in math revealed a high correlation between the thorough completion of a pretty involved demographics survey that was part of the test and the actual scores on the math test themselves. Now, this is, I think, middle school math. But the takeaway there, the indication is that good scores on a math test are correlated to persistence and to focus and to mental effort. And so if your attention or focus is not, if you can't gather that up and bring that focus, then it's likely that even fairly simple math might present a greater challenge than it normally should. Finally, well, not finally, but I alluded to this previously, the impact of media consumption. Okay. Our media consumption style is trending towards shorter and shorter and shorter segments. And one example of that is over the last 40 or 50 years, movies, theater movies and streaming movies, increasingly use more and more rapid cut scenes. So a cut scene is when an angle changes on a character that's speaking, or the scene moves to another character who's listening and then back quickly. Those are cut scenes. And if we watch movies like this, then what we actually get is our attention is trained to become accustomed to that switching in our environment. Now, you'll notice that typically our environment doesn't do rapid changes. Trees and animals and moving bodies of water don't do cutscenes. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that it's a bad technique in a movie, but I am saying that it supports our natural predisposition to seek novelty in our stimuli. Okay. And that's something that served our prairie roaming ancestors very well, if you take the evolutionary psychology perspective on this. But regardless, when we're small children, we don't have this capacity to focus, and we have to learn it and we have to train it. And media consumption, the way media is presented to us now, actually fights against that. So it's not the end of human civilization, but it is probably something that we should consider in our media diet and consumption. So I promised you some practical strategies for cultivating focus. So we talked a lot about, what the challenges were in our focus. And we realized that as knowledge workers, our attention is our primary productive asset. And to the degree that we can sharpen our attention, then we can produce more thorough work in less time. We make fewer mistakes. Okay. We do better work. We have deeper insights. And this is merely the way our 3 pounds of gray goo works. And if you're processing knowledge, if you're creating, then deeper insights correlate with more valuable creation. If you do knowledge work and you're creating a report on a subject and you're able to sit down and focus over it, then that lack of distraction, interruption helps you to stay in it and stay with it versus, being distracted and interrupted from all quarters. And that both extends our useful working period, but also makes it stronger and more intense. And we're better able to access different parts of our brain and different parts of our knowledge. And often, not always, but often that's where insight comes from. Let me take one more focused look at the situation. Let me perceive it from a different angle in a different way. And to bring a different light to something or a different lens to something is a challenging mental task. So, for example, Matt Church talks about, as we're thinking about something, a useful thought tool is to mentally consult other folks who may have a perspective on the issue or who may have expressed some expertise on the issue. And in that way, you can begin to see different angles on the subject of your thought. And combining those different angles and viewing them from those different perspectives can be a very, very insightful way to approach your work. I mean, quite often it's this new angle that produces a result to a thorny problem that we need to try to solve. And that flash of insight, well, oftentimes it comes from within us. And there are, I won't say predictable ways, but there are some ways that we are confident will help us get to that insight. But this is not that. This is a more intense thought process about it. And to take to take another human being's perspective on something thoroughly is a challenging mental task that requires some focus and some extended thought. And that's one of the ways that we can get these different insights. A lot of times when a physical problem needs to be solved, people talk about the experience of taking an object and rotating it mentally in a three-dimensional space and trying to imagine what it looks like from the other side if they've never seen it. And this kind of exercise requires thorough concentration. So, bringing all of that back together out into, practical, actionable information for you. So we'll talk about a few practical strategies. And certainly these are things that you've heard me talk about before if you're a fan of the podcast. So when we think about cultivating focus, probably the first thing that pops into most people's heads, and certainly into mine, is this notion of mindfulness. Some people refer to it as meditation. Mindfulness is a practice routine, and its goal is to help us build focus. Its goal is to help us understand when we're paying attention to something. It helps us train ourselves to notice when we get pulled off of that thing, and then to develop skills at bringing our attention back to where we want it. And this is well-trod ground out in YouTube and everywhere else about what are some useful mindfulness practices. Some of them are very elaborate, and some of them are religious in nature. Some of them are very mystical. People are now talking about psychedelics as ways to improve mindfulness, psychedelic drugs, of course. And, I'm like, well, maybe, but, can we start with something a little more simpler? Yeah. Can we start with simple things and then build up, and decide then if we need these more extreme measures? And one of the things that I've talked about before that is a mindfulness practice. It's a good practice either way, but it really does support mindfulness. And the one I'm talking about right now is practicing reading. Reading, then, is an inherent act of focus, and it's an outstanding training ground for the focus skill. Because think about what you have to do in order to read. You're in some environment, and you may have curated the environment that it's quiet and interruption free. You may not have curated your own brain so that it's distraction free, but here you are with a book or an ebook. Okay, probably not an audiobook, but I'm on record with this before. And in order to accomplish reading, you have to keep your eyes on the book, and you have to move your eyes in particular ways. Now, I'm not talking about speed reading training here. I'm just talking about regular reading. And what's required is to maintain a particular level of mental awareness of the things that are going past your eyes. I'm sure we've all had the experience, maybe in the past when we were younger, of our eyes moving across a page and nothing changing in our skulls, right? Our eyes keep moving even though our brains are thinking about something else. And so bringing that attention back to where we want it to be, recognizing that it wandered off as quickly as we can, then bringing that back to the written material on the page is very good training. I would say watching movies in a particular way is probably good training, but the movies themselves don't lend to this kind of effort, as we talked about before with the increasingly rapid cutscenes. So when we're doing these activities, we have the opportunity to engage and focus. But I think reading is the absolute entry level skill for mindfulness. And it also has other great benefits around our learning and around our training our brains in certain kinds of thinking patterns. And so, if you're not a reader and you want more focus, then I would suggest that you start bringing some reading into your mental dojo, right? And you start looking into the notion of reading, because another great thing about reading, it really doesn't matter what you read. Okay, and if you're out of the habit of reading, then I certainly suggest you start with fiction, because fiction and story, just because we're humans, fiction and story brings us along. Not only that, but it's also pretty easy to notice when you blanked out and skipped over something, because you had this one mental image of what the character might have been doing, and then you zone out for a little while, and then you get back in, and the character's in a different place, or what they're saying doesn't jive with what the last thing you right. And you can then notice, versus, let's say, the other extreme of writing, which is a textbook or a technical manual, where you're just picking up detail after detail after detail. Well, if you miss a detail, it's hard to know that you missed it, right? And so I think this is why textbooks are such a challenge for students. And many people have told me, and I think this is perhaps overstated, but many people have told me that their master's degree beat reading out of them. They no longer enjoy reading because of their master's degree and all the reading that they had to do there. Maybe, but we can get back on this horse. Okay, so reading. I would say maybe another one, and this is just common everyday stuff. Okay, I would say supporting our focus. So reading would be intensifying our focus. I would say, well, another way to intensify our focus is to try to learn a new skill, not new information, a new skill, physical skill. If you're a knowledge worker, I would suggest that one of the more valuable skills you could learn is to type faster. Think about how much time you spend touching a keyboard. And if you were 10% faster typist or 20% faster typist, most people type between 45 and 60 words a minute. And it's not at all unreasonable to double that speed. Now, it's going to take a little while, but imagine how much time you spend touching a keyboard and how much of that would shrink if you could get your thoughts recorded as fast as they're produced. And the act of thinking about how to type interferes with what else is going on in your mind at the time. And typing it can be its own distraction or interruption. But if you were very fluid with typing and you could get the words onto the page with the same speed that they occur in your mind. So I would say, typing is probably a good skill. You learn mindfulness by forcing yourself to actually do the disciplined work to learn it, to practice it, because that's the only way to pick it up is to practice. And then it can produce this skill of you being able to record your thought as fast as your thought happens. Okay. Now, when we look at this situation, of course, voice recording can help. Okay. It can produce some of these same things. I've tried to do it, and it's not as fluid as you think. So much of our thought life, or my thought life, is done with internal voice. And thus far, as I've been trying to record my thoughts at the same speed, verbally record them at the same speed that they happen, there's still some resistance to that. So I don't know what's going on there, but certainly working and picking up skills is something that can help you exercise your focus. Another tactic is to savor. So this is back to Winifred Gallagher and her book Wrapped. And she talks about this idea of savoring, which is an intentional act of attention. And the goal is to take time to more deeply experience the sensations of whatever it is you're doing, particularly assuming that it's pleasant. And many examples abound, really take a little time and taste the chocolate. Try and describe it to yourself rather than just going, oh, that's good. Try to develop some vocabulary around that and consider it while you're doing it. Lots of different ways to do this, right? Different things you enjoy, like food, and to savor that, okay? Actually, savoring, I have seen some evidence that savoring is actually good in reducing the number of calories you consume. And so there you go. It's a little bit of a win-win. It makes you, a more focused and thoughtful person. It makes you a little bit happier because you're savoring these good experiences, and it could knock off a couple of calories rather than just gobbling down handfuls of M&Ms. Okay, so hey, another thing that Gallagher suggests when she talks about savoring is to allow yourself to get lost in the activity. Now, I would say one big part of this is to be real careful about tightly setting an agenda around an experience. In other words, if you feel like you're in a hurry and you're constantly watching the clock for your next thing, then it's going to be hard to mentally let yourself get lost in it, right? And then, you're constantly trying to rush through the experience or trying to complete the experience or whatever it is. And so that getting lost in the activity, that can be it can require a little setup. And then another way maybe to approach this savoring is try to be very conscious about media as you consume it. Really try to focus. I'll give you an example of this. I recently found out that my daughter, one of her favorite genres of music is movie soundtracks. I have never listened intently, well, not never, okay, because I watched Top Gun when I was a young man, and Footloose and all those 80s movies with the top 20 hits in the soundtrack. Okay. But that's different than what my daughter experiences. When she's watching a movie, she's actively listening to the soundtrack. Now, for me, that's a different level of, for lack of a better word, focus or mindfulness about a movie. And it's fascinating that, and I only found this out recently, right? She's 24 years old. And I just found this out. And it's so fascinating to me that's something that she developed the ability to do. Now, to be fair, she has trained for a few years in music. She played the flute. And so she has that sense of kind of more orchestral music, perhaps, than her rock and roll dad. But maybe that's a way to do it. If you like music, then the next time you watch a movie, try to absorb the soundtrack as well in spots and bring that into the experience. This is an activity that I'm going to attempt as I try to increase my focus. And so even if you don't, right, try to watch a movie with your full attention and to really focus on what's going on the screen. Try and notice the cutscenes, or try and notice the costumes in a different way. Okay. And so even things like media consumption can be turned to supporting activities for this deeper focus. Certainly when we talk about focus, managing distraction, and I've alluded to this, is very important. Okay. Now, when I say distractions, okay, I should say managing interruptions for the time that we want to focus. And I think this is something that most people try to do. But there's it's something we should mention, okay? Particularly as you're training your focus. If you want to take up reading as a mindfulness exercise, and again, I think it's a great one, okay? Then when you first start out, you might want to find a specifically quiet environment so that you can really study how your attention pulls itself away sometimes from what you're trying to do. So managing those distractions, managing interruptions, both the external kind where we can close the door, turn off our phone, but also the internal kind, which has a lot more to do with clearing out our brains. Thinking about active focus training, right? Our attention can be strengthened. It can be built up, and it just needs exercises and training regimens. And they don't have to be climbing up to the top of a mountain and spend 2 weeks in a cave. I mean, we talked about some that are actually fairly straightforward. And so that'll help you manage that internal interruption, what we call around these parts, we call distraction. Certainly avoid multitasking, both for the period of time that you're trying to focus naturally, but also think about trying to avoid multitasking in general as a way to hopefully avoid building the habit of thought that comes along with multitasking, right? Because it's not actually, if you get good at multitasking, it's not because your brain can consider two things at the same time. It's because one of two things has happened. Either the combination of the two tasks is learned and they're integrated into a single task. Okay. You can do this with patting your head and rubbing your stomach. Enough practice and you'll figure out how to do it. Right. And then it sort of, in some ways, it coalesces into a single task. But also that constant ability to switch your attention from one target to another, because that becomes a habit of thought, and it can become a default mode through the mechanisms that we talked about, through our novelty-seeking brains. I would say at a minimum, multitasking, if you're involved in training your focus, I would say at a minimum, multitasking is going to fight against that training. So you might want to be careful in that area. And particularly default and casual multitasking. Okay, this whole business of, I'm watching a movie and, oh, I get out my phone to look something up. I mean, right? Can I resist that impulse? Can I turn off my phone while I'm watching the movie? These kinds of ideas. So a lot of this has to do with making conscious choices about how you engage with your attention, or maybe more correctly, how you engage your attention into activities. So just be intentional about it, particularly as training. Okay. When you go to the gym, you put on your shoes and you put on your workout clothes and you get in your car and you drive someplace. Well, bring that same mindset into training your focus, should you choose to do that. And then finally, I would say, recognize information, air quotes here, junk food. Cal Newport is on this topic recently. He talks about it a good bit. But the problem with junk food is that it's overprocessed, and it's specifically designed to act on our nervous system to be irresistible. It's designed to get you to eat the next one, just like Facebook is designed for you to pull down one more time. Okay. And much like junk food, this over-processed, packaged information has lost nuance, and it's lost mental nourishment. All that's been extracted out of it. And it trains us to consume automatically without ever even considering whether this topic is worth deep engagement. And so just because we can engage in these kinds of attention activities doesn't mean we should. I mean, sometimes novelty-seeking brain, great, sometimes indulgent. But just like your diet, okay? If you get, past a certain point with Cheetos, that's all you want to eat. And that's bad for you. And the same thing, at least Cal Newport hypothesizes, and I agree with him, the same thing is happening with our media consumption. And you can't consume media without using your attention. So in some ways, we're training our attention to be flighty and not focused and concentrated, particularly when we consume these kinds of things. So think about some of these ideas. And I'll run down the list again real quick, okay, without belaboring each point kind of like I just did. But so thinking about mindfulness, okay, and it's simple to get into mindfulness. You can start, 3 or 4 minutes at a time working on mindfulness exercises. Think about reading, like a book or an ebook, but not an audiobook. So something that requires you to really focus, and something that will tell you when your focus is wandered away. And feel free to start with trashy fiction. Go for it. I like to read humor books, right? Terry Pratchett is a favorite of mine, and it just draws you in and keeps your attention. And that way you can begin to feel the pleasure of it. We talked about other things, typing as a way to pick up a skill, and training yourself in a skill is a great way to exercise your focus in your mindfulness. Savoring, very pleasant way to train your focus, because you're doing a pleasurable activity, and so you're focusing on it. And one of the things Gallagher talks about is this brings joy into our lives as we more deeply understand these pleasant experiences. Certainly set yourself up properly if you're going to engage in this training. Manage your distractions. Have the right mindset. Okay, you can train this thing up. Generally avoiding multitasking and avoiding this media junk food that's so prevalent in our culture. So all of these things will help you, in my conception, will help you deepen your focus. And as a knowledge worker, that's critically important. So, just to conclude, we've discussed how our ability to focus and this critical skill for optimum performance, it's under threat in our increasingly fragmented and distraction-laden world. Society has evolved to reduce the natural physical exercise that we once got in the course of our day-to-day. I don't mean that that's the intention of our society, but it is a definite outgrowth. And when we notice this and we notice the effect of less exercise, less physical activity on our bodies, we started going to the gym. And so our modern media and information environment is beginning to act to deny us, and again, I don't necessarily mean intentionally, deny us the mental exercise that we need to have to support, sustain, maintain our focus muscle. Okay. Now, good news is we can take action. We can begin to manage ourselves and to train ourselves within the mental side of things in much the same ways that we do in the physical. And this means extending taking care of ourselves, which is what we say we're doing in the gym, over into the mental realm. Physically, we know we need to choose healthy food over unhealthy, and we need to choose exercise over sitting in the recliner because we know it's good for us. And we can apply that same logic and discipline to our attention and to our media consumption and to what happens to us mentally. So we can choose to be intentional about the great joy of savoring a wonderful experience, right? Not rushing through it and setting it up under certain conditions and boundaries such that we have the mental space to do that, savoring. Thinking about dedicating our attention to one task at a time versus this scattered multitasking thing. And then, we need to actively fight back because our natural pull is towards novelty and distraction. So we can do this, okay? Some of you might prefer a term like mental hygiene, and that's fine. Go into the mental gym, okay? And I, of course, don't necessarily mean these intelligence building or brain building apps out there in the world, but I have experimented with them. Maybe that's part. So when we can do this, we begin to rebuild or strengthen our capacity for focus. But we're also then cultivating other kind of mental habits that lead to, in my conception, a richer, more productive, more fulfilling. If you learn how to really pay attention to a conversational partner, really give your attention to someone that you care deeply about, I think you'll find this to be very rewarding. So I would suggest that we can commit to doing this for a significant period of time. And I think that discipline and that training is going to help us. And we just, much like going to the gym, okay, start small, do something. And then over time, the capacity will grow. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.